They seated me in the far left corner of the auditorium, in a folding chair that wobbled every time I crossed my legs. The seat assignment said Row G, Section 4, which for context was just a polite way of saying behind the pillar and 2 rows down from the audio technician. From where I sat, I couldn't see the stage unless I leaned so far left I looked like a dying fern, which was perhaps fitting, considering I was being treated like one, decorative, mostly green, and only remembered when something needed dusting. I didn't argue with the usher. I didn't ask to be moved. I just smoothed my skirt, adjusted my cardigan, and reminded myself I wasn't there to be noticed. I was there to witness. 3 rows in front of me sat my ex-husband, Malcolm, and his wife of 6 years, Tessa. Tessa had the sort of platinum hair that made salon owners weep with joy and the sort of laugh that carried like a foghorn in marble rooms. She wore pearls that likely cost more than my car and a dress designed to be photographed, even if no one had asked. Beside her, Malcolm looked distinguished in the way retired men often do, tanned, relaxed, under the illusion that fatherhood was mostly about writing checks and showing up on days like this. When the announcer called Juliet's name, summa cum laude Juliet Price, the room erupted in applause. She looked radiant. That's not bitterness speaking. That's just fact. She floated across the stage in crimson robes, valedictorian sash perfectly in place, her dark hair swept into an elegant bun. She looked every bit the ivy-bound daughter of wealth and potential. She smiled, waved, bowed her head slightly, and stepped to the podium. "Thank you," she began, voice steady, polished. "To the professors who challenged me, the friends who inspired me, and of course to my father and Tessa, for always supporting my dreams." I waited, just a beat, then another. That was it. Not a word for the woman who had proofread her essays at 2 a.m., who spent weekends coaching her through debates, who clipped coupons so she could afford the extracurriculars that looked good on college applications. Not a single syllable for the mother who'd raised her while her father was busy finding new wives and remote golf courses. I didn't cry. Not then. I just clasped my hands and pressed my thumbnail into the soft pad of my palm until it stung. Sometimes pain is useful. It sharpens the moment. Behind me, someone coughed. Somewhere across the hall, a cell phone buzzed. Life moved on. My name is Dr. Cordelia Price. I'm 72 years old, a retired legal historian, widow of the late Benedict Price, a man brilliant enough to see danger before it knocked. I taught constitutional law at Holwell University for 3 decades, and I still keep my lecture notes pressed between linen folders like old love letters. I also happen to be the mother of the woman on that stage. If you're watching this, drop a comment and tell me what part of the world you're tuning in from. I find geography often says more about people than psychology. And if you've ever been erased by your own child in a room full of strangers, you'll understand why I didn't leave after the speech. I stayed. I clapped. I smiled. Because Juliet might have forgotten me in that moment, but she was about to remember me for the rest of her life. The ceremony ended in a blur of confetti cannons and string quartet music. Parents swarmed the lawn with oversized bouquets and camera phones. I lingered near a marble column, waiting my turn like a waitress at a wedding she wasn't invited to. Juliet eventually spotted me. Her eyes flashed with something unreadable. Guilt? Irritation? Or was it just surprise that I'd bothered to come? "Mother," she said, like the word required effort, "you made it." "Of course," I said. "It's not every day one's only daughter graduates at the top of her class while forgetting her origins." She blinked. Whether she registered the barb, I couldn't say. She kissed my cheek, the air above it technically, and gestured toward Malcolm and Tessa, who were walking toward us with champagne flutes and unearned pride. "We're heading to brunch at Bellamy's," Juliet said. "You'll join us?" That was a test. Bellamy's was Tessa's haunt, all glass walls and edible flowers on appetizers. I wasn't invited. I was being offered a performance slot. I shook my head. "I have something for you, actually. A little graduation token." I handed her a small velvet box. She opened it without enthusiasm. Inside was a slender gold necklace with a modest clasp. Elegant, understated, forgettable to anyone who didn't know what they were looking for. Juliet forced a smile. "Thanks, Mom. It's nice." "Oh, it's more than nice," I said, brushing a strand of hair from her shoulder. "Inside that clasp sits something far more valuable than diamonds. But that's not your business. Not yet." She furrowed her brow. I gave her a soft pat on the hand. "Enjoy Bellamy's," I said, and turned before anyone could suggest I take a rideshare. Some gifts are meant to be unwrapped slowly, and some stories don't begin until after the applause fades. The brunch was held at Bellamy's, a place that serves food in geometric patterns and believes discomfort is the price of aesthetic. The chairs were armless, the cutlery matte black, and the server looked at me like I'd wandered in from a less curated century. Juliet had reserved a corner table near the window, a clear signal to passers-by that she belonged to a life of light, glass, and overpriced rosé. She sat in the middle like a modern saint, flanked by Malcolm on her left and Tessa on her right. I was granted the seat at the end, the conversational penalty box. "Mom," Juliet said, dabbing her lip with a napkin she hadn't used, "I didn't think you'd actually join us." "I'm full of surprises," I said, folding into the chair like I was auditioning for a documentary on invisibility. The waiter arrived, ready to recite the specials like they were sonnets. I asked for tea. He blinked like I'd mispronounced champagne. After a beat, he nodded. Earl Grey apparently was still legal. Juliet was glowing, basking in attention, and Malcolm was performing fatherhood like he'd invented it. Tessa added color commentary. Mostly compliments, none of them original. "So," Juliet said finally, turning to me with the soft diplomacy usually reserved for charity cases. "You said you brought something?" I nodded and reached into my purse. A small velvet box, discreet and old-fashioned, the kind used in jewelry stores that don't have Instagram accounts. Her smile twitched as she opened it. Inside, a slender gold chain, minimalist in design, almost deliberately unimpressive. The clasp was slightly larger than usual, but unless you were Benedict Price or his widow, you wouldn't think twice. Juliet held it up like she was inspecting a museum replica. "Oh," she said, lips parting into a practiced smile. "It's very classic." Classic. A word people use when they want to say underwhelming without being cut out of the will. I sipped my tea. "Yes, I had it made especially for you." Her eyebrows did a tiny dance. "Really?" "It's handcrafted," I said. "One of a kind. And the clasp? Well, let's just say it does more than keep it around your neck." Malcolm chuckled, oblivious. "What, is it a locket?" "No," I said, setting the cup down. "It's a key." Juliet looked at me sideways. "A key to what?" I smiled. The kind of smile that doesn't open doors but locks them behind you. "Inside the clasp sits something far more valuable than diamonds," I said. "But that's not your business, not yet." She laughed, light, nervous, brittle. "You always did love your riddles." And she always did love answers she didn't have to earn. Enter Cameron Voss. He arrived like he was walking onto a runway that just happened to be in a restaurant. Navy blazer, expensive loafers, and the type of haircut that cost more than my monthly water bill. He leaned over and kissed Juliet's cheek like he was claiming her for branding purposes. "Sorry I'm late," he said, brushing invisible lint from his sleeve. "The parking here is designed to punish the successful." That was Cameron in a sentence. Humble bragging as performance art. He extended a hand toward me. "Dr. Price, always a pleasure." I shook it. His grip was firm but not warm, like he'd memorized the etiquette but not the sentiment. "Cameron," I said, "I see you've survived another week without an emergency trust fund activation." He laughed a bit too loud. "You always know how to keep me on my toes." "I do my best," I replied. "I wouldn't want you to pull anything reaching for Juliet's future." He blinked. Juliet glanced between us. Tessa pretended not to notice. I watched Cameron's eyes flick to the necklace, then back to me. The look wasn't long, but it was sharp, calculating. the way wolves look at locked doors. What a thoughtful gift, he said, recovering. Very timeless. Indeed, I said. Some things are meant to last. Others are meant to be tested. No one spoke for a beat. Juliet cleared her throat. We were actually going to talk to you about some financial stuff soon, Mom. Oh? I said, tilting my head. Are you planning a fundraiser? She smiled, but the temperature had dropped a few degrees. Cameron rested his hand on hers. A signal, a script cue. But I wasn't interested in skipping ahead. Let's enjoy the meal, I said, tucking the box back into my purse. There'll be plenty of time for paperwork. Juliet nodded. Cameron watched me the way a thief studies a locked display case. And me? I just smiled and stirred my tea. Because sometimes the smallest gifts carry the largest consequences. And sometimes a necklace is just a necklace, until it isn't. It started with a phone call. Not from Juliet, mind you. Juliet doesn't call. She texts, she schedules, she delegates emotional bandwidth. No, this was a direct line from Cameron Voss, delivered with just enough casual charm to set off internal fire alarms in 3 different quadrants of my brain. Dr. Price, he said. I was just thinking about our conversation at brunch and thought I'd check in. There had been no conversation, just carefully sharpened small talk, and the unspoken tension of 2 people pretending not to study each other's teeth. Chivalry's not dead after all, I said. He laughed, probably picturing himself in a hero's cape, unaware he was already in the opening act of a Greek tragedy. I've been reading up on estate planning, he continued, as though I might find that seductive. Just wanted to offer any help if you're thinking of streamlining things. Streamlining. A lovely euphemism for signing your independence over in ink. That's very civic-minded of you, I replied, though I wasn't aware Juliet's fiancé moonlighted as a fiduciary advisor. Well, not officially, he said. But I've picked up a thing or two. It's just, you've built such a legacy. Wouldn't want the details to become burdensome. Ah, yes, the soft sell. You're aging, you're alone, you've likely misplaced your own will, and I, the very man who ordered a $24 salad last weekend, would be honored to rescue you from your own complexity. You'd be surprised how entertaining a little burden can be, I said, especially when the paperwork bites back. He paused, a flicker of recalibration. Of course, I just meant people our age. Our age? Well, your age, he corrected with a laugh that didn't land. Shouldn't have to worry about logistics. Oh, I don't worry about them, I said. I just weaponize them. Another pause. He tried again, pivoting like a man who just realized the floor plan didn't match the blueprint. Maybe we could get dinner sometime, just the 2 of us, have a real conversation. That one did land, like a suspicious package on my intellectual doorstep. Dinner, from Cameron. Not Juliet, not family, not obligation. I could practically hear the gears grinding in that finely pomaded head of his. Dinner, I repeated. Is this a date or an ambush? He chuckled. It's just dinner. I respect your insight. Honestly, Juliet and I both do. Juliet respected my insight the way cats respect closed doors, mostly as a temporary inconvenience. Still, I agreed. Not because I was flattered, but because invitations from predators are often better than subpoenas. You just have to know when to bring your own pen. Next Thursday? He offered. Perfect, I said. I'll bring an appetite and my reading glasses. We hung up. I poured myself a bourbon and stared out the kitchen window at the garden Benedict had planted when Juliet was 5. The rose bushes had outlived his body, his will, and apparently his daughter's gratitude. Funny how thorns do that. Cameron was circling. He smelled blood, or what he thought was blood. But it wasn't just curiosity driving him. It was speed. People with plans always have tells. Cameron's was speed. He was trying to move fast. Fast enough that Juliet wouldn't catch on. Fast enough that I wouldn't have time to consult a lawyer. Fast enough that momentum would replace consent. But speed, my dear Cameron, is for the impatient. And I've spent my life teaching constitutional law to students who thought the Bill of Rights was a TED Talk. Patience is my native language. The next few days passed with eerie calm. Juliet texted twice, "Hope you're well," and Cameron mentioned dinner. I didn't reply to either, not out of malice, just out of strategy. Thursday arrived like a politely sharpened knife. I dressed simply, charcoal dress, pearl studs, Benedict's old watch, still elegant, still ticking. I wore no makeup beyond tinted lip balm and the look women save for chess games and war crimes tribunals. Cameron had chosen a restaurant downtown, trendy, discreet, flattering lighting, a place where fraud could wear a blazer and still order steak tartare. He stood as I entered, smiling like a man who believed he'd already won. "Cordelia," he said, using my first name like we'd shared a secret instead of a brunch. I smiled back. "Cameron, let's dine. I'm eager to hear what's weighing so heavily on your conscience." He laughed, not knowing yet that the table was already tilted, and not in his favor. The restaurant Cameron selected was one of those sleek, dimly lit places where everything is matte, the music is ambient, and the waitstaff wear expressions of mild intellectual contempt. I was led to a corner booth by a hostess so symmetrical, I briefly wondered if she'd been printed rather than born. Cameron was already seated, of course, punctuality being the first virtue of a man with an agenda. "Cordelia," he said, standing and reaching for a handshake that doubled as performance. "You look wonderful." "And you look rehearsed," I said, slipping into the booth across from him. "Shall we begin?" He chuckled, then signaled to the waiter, who delivered 2 glasses of wine, already poured. How thoughtful, or presumptive, often the same thing. "I hope Pinot's still your favorite," Cameron said, settling back with the ease of someone who'd Googled me 3 times before arriving. "Depends on the day," I said, eyeing the glass but not touching it. "And the company." He smiled, a half-second too long. The small talk lasted just long enough to establish that Juliet was so proud of everything she's achieved, and that they were just thinking about the future. A dangerous phrase, just thinking, always a prelude to something binding. By the time the entrees arrived, mine a grilled fish that had apparently died for art, his a steak so rare I could hear it whisper. He made his move. "I wanted to bring something tonight," he said, reaching into his briefcase with the confidence of a magician unveiling a dove. "Just a few documents Julia and I have been reviewing with a financial advisor." I raised an eyebrow. "Bedtime reading?" He laughed, sliding a folder across the table like it might tip the balance of my world. "Nothing urgent," he said. "Just smart planning. Things like power of attorney, health proxies, asset direction. You know, protective stuff." "Protective," I repeated, as I opened the folder with the care one uses for unstable devices and betrayal disguised as care. The documents were crisp, printed on heavy paper with clean margins and an overuse of the word streamline. "I thought you two were planning a wedding," I said, scanning the first page. "Did the florist recommend a durable power of attorney?" Cameron's smile faltered. "It's just about preparing for the unexpected." "Unexpected like a car crash? Or unexpected like an aging mother who hasn't yet signed over her checking account?" He leaned in, dropping his voice to that sincere, gravelly tone men use when they're about to sell you a coffin with a view. "Juliet and I just want to make sure you're protected. There are so many scams targeting seniors, you know." "Ah, the elderly scam angle. Classic." "Indeed," I said. "Terrible, the way young people prey on older ones these days." He nodded, missing the sting entirely. "Plus," he added, "we'd be able to make health decisions for you, should anything happen. It's really just peace of mind." Peace of mind. Another phrase with a suspicious scent, like lavender oil in a basement. I turned a page. There it was, financial oversight, real estate rights, and a little gem titled Durable Delegation of Authority. Juliet and Cameron, listed jointly. "I notice you didn't include a notary," I said calmly. "Well," he said, "we didn't want to rush anything." "Of course not. That would be indecent." Cameron's fork hovered midair as I closed the folder and slid it neatly back toward him. "It's a lovely draft," I said. "Really, The fonts alone must have cost a fortune. He hesitated. Would you like to think about it? I wouldn't dream of deciding on something so comprehensive over a single glass of Pinot. He smiled again, tight this time. Take your time. I'm happy to walk you through anything that seems confusing. Oh, I won't be confused, I said, standing. But I will be consulting my own attorney. I'm old-fashioned like that. I prefer betrayal to be notarized properly. The look on his face, that flicker between frustration and recalibration, was almost touching. We said our goodbyes with the polite friction of two fencers sheathing blades. When I got home, I placed the documents on my kitchen table, poured a proper glass of bourbon, and read every word. Then I read them again. Because I didn't sign anything, but I read everything, twice. It was nearly midnight when I opened the drawer. Not the one with takeout menus and expired coupons, the one with the key. A small brass thing, unassuming, heavy with meaning, like most items designed by Benedict Price. I unlocked the cabinet in my study and retrieved the fireproof box that had been untouched for nearly 6 years. His handwriting was still on the label. Cordelia, for when you need to remember what matters. The last time I'd seen this will, Juliet had been 20, entitled, gifted, blind to anything without sparkle. Now she was 30, polished, strategic, and just as blind, only better dressed. I sat down beneath the warm lamp, adjusted my glasses, and read. Benedict's voice came back to me in ink and clauses. The trust is to be activated only under one condition, that Juliet demonstrates the capacity to see value beyond its presentation. If she cannot see beneath the surface, she is not ready for what lies beneath it. He was maddeningly cryptic, even in legal language. But then, that was Benedict. A man who hid pearls in poetry books and once wired a stock portfolio into the metadata of a jazz CD, just to see if anyone would notice. Hide it in plain sight, he'd told me once, pouring wine into those cut glass goblets we only used when discussing danger or dividends. The best protection is presentation. Appear modest. Embed meaning. At the time, I'd rolled my eyes. You want me to turn inheritance into a puzzle box? No, he'd said, tapping the side of my temple. I want you to be the final cipher. Let her prove herself, or let her prove her price. And I had. The necklace had been chosen months ago, a fine silver chain, deliberately unremarkable, with a custom clasp designed by one of Benedict's eccentric friends in Switzerland. Inside it, a micro-encrypted key to a legal safe. Inside that, the $12 million trust. All of it contingent on Juliet demonstrating one simple thing: depth. So far, she'd flunked that test with enthusiasm. I closed the will and stared at my own reflection in the beveled glass of the cabinet door. Not a widow anymore, not in the emotional sense. I hadn't mourned Benedict in the soft, sobbing ways people expect. I missed him like you miss the other half of a good idea. The sharpener to your pencil, the filter to your logic. We weren't romantic, we were aligned. And Juliet, bless her designer shoes, had no idea what kind of chessboard she'd walked into. I picked up my phone and scrolled to a number I hadn't used in over a year. Harper Quill, former estate attorney for Benedict, mid-60s, wore tweed in July, spoke in complete, legally binding sentences, kept client secrets like they were state secrets. I'd once watched her reduce a Wall Street broker to tears using only 3 words. Do you mind? She answered on the second ring. Cordelia, she said, without a trace of surprise. Which clause are we activating? I assume you remember the Price Trust? I remember all the trusts with booby traps. Good, I need confirmation. Is the micro key embedded in the clasp still functional? Yes, still linked to the encrypted vault. No one's accessed it since Benedict died. And the conditional clause? If Juliet engages in any attempt to manipulate, coerce, or reassign your assets without full voluntary consent, she is disqualified. Permanently. Perfect, I said. Let's assume she's about to. There was a pause. I'll prep the trigger documents, Harper said, cool as dry ice. Anything else? I may need a forensic accountant. Preemptive? Defensive. Understood. I hung up and stared at the necklace still in its velvet box. Juliet hadn't worn it yet. Of course she hadn't. It wasn't Cartier. It didn't broadcast power. It simply held it, hidden in a clasp, buried in plain sight. A woman in the mirror looked back at me, gray hair pinned, pearls in her ears, jaw set like a gavel. This wasn't sentiment. It was strategy. And the game had just entered its middle phase. Harper Quill didn't do small talk. She did precision. That's why I didn't bother with pleasantries when I stepped into her office the next morning. She was already waiting at the long walnut conference table with a leather folder labeled Price Trust, Active Clause Review. She'd added the date in pencil, as if permanence offended her sense of order. "You came alone," she noted. "I find schemes tend to arrive in pairs. I prefer to travel solo." She gave the faintest hint of a smile, which for Harper was the emotional equivalent of a standing ovation. We sat. She opened the folder. "The clasp is still active," she began, sliding over a series of diagrams. "Your late husband's design used a proprietary microdrive embedded beneath the latch. To the naked eye, it's just brushed silver. To anyone with legal clearance and a biometric key, which lives in my fingerprint," I interrupted, "and one encrypted USB in your safe." Harper nodded once. "Inside that drive is a key to a private legal vault, stored offshore and mirrored across 2 domestic holding firms. The vault contains the documentation for an irrevocable trust." "And the value?" She pushed over the portfolio summary. I scanned it. The numbers didn't lie. Not that they ever did. Only the people quoting them. $12.3 million. Grown, not touched, self-sustaining. Hedged in ways Benedict had explained once, somewhere between Bordeaux and banter. I'd half listened. I now regretted the half. "And the clause?" I asked, still flipping through. "Active. If Juliet initiates or participates in any form of financial coercion, misrepresentation, or undue influence toward you, the trust is reassigned. Permanently. No contest." "Reassigned to whom?" "You," Harper said. "Unconditionally." I exhaled through my nose, slow and deliberate. A smile curled, not indulgent, not cruel, just quietly pleased. "He really built it." "You built it," Harper corrected. "Benedict may have drawn the blueprint, but you're the one who made sure the locks were in place." I looked down at the necklace I'd worn under a silk scarf. Modest, elegant, utterly unsuspicious. A Trojan horse. "You built a Trojan horse," I said aloud, not to Harper, but to the man who hadn't been in the room for 6 years. "And now I'm holding the gate." The clasp clicked softly between my fingers, an ordinary sound for something that guarded 7 figures and several lives' worth of future headaches. Harper leaned forward, elbows on the table, her voice cool and factual. "Do you want to activate the preliminary monitoring protocol?" Define monitoring. "I install a compliance tracker on Juliet's communications, legally through public channels and open metadata. If she consults a lawyer, drafts documents, or even hints at altering your estate, we'll know." I nodded. "Start today," I said, "and log Cameron's name as well. His involvement has reached the sniffing around stage." Harper opened her laptop. "Already done. He subscribed to a fiduciary lifestyle podcast last week. That's usually phase 1. I raised an eyebrow. Harper glanced up, deadpan. "Predators like to practice sounding informed before the pounce. Podcasts, TED Talks, LinkedIn courses." "Fascinating," I said. "Does he know estate law podcasts don't actually teach law?" "They teach tone," Harper replied. "Tone is what convinces people you're doing them a favor while picking their pocket." I sat back in my chair, letting the reality settle around me like silk. The trust existed. The clause was active. The necklace was the key. And Juliet, the daughter I'd once read bedtime stories to, the one who used to braid my hair during thunderstorms, was walking straight into a minefield built by her own bloodline. "It feels poetic," I murmured, "that all this rests on whether she chooses character over convenience." "Poetry is rare in trust law," Harper said, closing the folder, "but I'd say this qualifies." As I stood to leave, I slipped the necklace back around my neck and fastened the clasp. It didn't shimmer, It didn't sparkle, but it hummed with purpose. Outside, the afternoon sun bounced off the mirrored building across the street. In the reflection, I caught my own image, shoulders square, eyes clear, lips curled into something too knowing to be called a smile. I wasn't just wearing a necklace, I was wearing a net. And Juliet, bless her entitlement, was about to trip straight into it. The trick wasn't acting forgetful. The trick was knowing exactly what to forget. Like the name of Juliet's alma mater when speaking to her fiancé, or which cabinet I kept the sugar in when Juliet visited, or casually mixing up the decade I bought my house. Little things, just enough to make a manipulator think they've spotted a seam. Juliet noticed. Her concern arrived by text, disguised as care. "Hey, Mom, you sounded a little confused on the phone. Just checking in. Love you." I replied with a typo and a heart emoji placed 3 spaces too far to the right. Meanwhile, Cameron started calling more often. Voice dipped in fake warmth, like a con man pouring syrup over a razor. "Thought I'd stop by this week," he offered on Tuesday. "No occasion," he added. "Just want to make sure you're doing okay." Of course he did. That Friday, I accidentally mentioned to him that I couldn't quite remember if I'd paid the property tax this year. Or was it last? He offered to take a look at the records. "I wouldn't want you to get overwhelmed," he said, with the soft condescension of a man who once asked me if I knew what a PDF was. I nodded slowly, almost dazed. "You're so good with computers." The compliment physically pained me. He smiled like I'd handed him a key. I had, but it wasn't to my finances, it was to his ego. The following week, a silver sedan pulled into my driveway just after noon. I was already at the window, Earl Grey in hand, watching the performance unfold. Juliet got out first, followed by Cameron in his respectable blazer, the kind men wear when they want to look both casual and capable. And then came the guests. 2 people I hadn't met before. One carrying a briefcase and one with a notary journal under her arm. The kind of entourage that doesn't arrive for lunch. They arrive for signatures. I greeted them at the door with the smile I reserve for amateur magicians and tax auditors. "Mom, this is Mr. Sterling," Juliet announced, her tone buttered with obligation. "He's, an estate consultant, and this is Nancy, she's with him." I tilted my head at them like one might at mildly interesting insects. "My, what a formal surprise." Cameron jumped in. "We just thought, since you've been mentioning some confusion, it might be time to streamline things. For your peace of mind." "Ah," I said, letting my voice drift. "So thoughtful." Nancy tried to hand me a clipboard. I ignored it. Instead, I shuffled over to the mantel and picked up an old photo of Juliet as a toddler. She used to insist on wearing fairy wings to the supermarket, I told the room. Didn't care one bit who stared. Juliet's expression froze. She hated personal stories in front of strangers, especially ones that made her look whimsical rather than polished. I smiled and returned the photo to its place. "Let's sit," I said. We gathered at the dining room table, papers stacked neatly, pen uncapped, notary ready. Cameron began explaining the protective revisions and transfer clauses, language soaked in euphemism, as if they were offering me spa vouchers instead of legal extinction. "Just initial here," he said at one point, tapping the page like a waiter pointing to the dessert menu. I stared at the paper, then at Cameron, then back at the paper. "Oh, heavens," I said with a little gasp. "I think I left the oven on." There was no oven on, but it gave me just enough of an excuse to leave the room, retrieve my glasses, which were already in my pocket, and return with a freshly blank expression. I picked up the pen, hovered it dramatically over the document, then sneezed, accidentally flinging it across the table. "Oops," I said sweetly. "Hands aren't what they used to be." We spent the next 5 minutes hunting for the pen under the sideboard, by which point I'd grown tired and suggested they leave the documents with me to look over slowly. Juliet's jaw clenched. Cameron's eye twitched. They left with forced smiles and the briefcase still full. As I closed the door behind them, I muttered to myself, For a man obsessed with planning, he certainly underestimated the stamina of old women. Then I poured myself another cup of tea and went to the study, where I signed nothing, but logged everything. Cameron invited me to dinner again. He said it like it was casual, like we were old friends catching up, rather than opponents circling the same prize from different corners of a chessboard. The restaurant this time was Italian, family-owned, candle-lit, one of those places where the walls were covered in sepia-toned photos of people who looked like they knew how to keep secrets. I took that as a compliment. He pulled out my chair, unnecessarily, and offered the wine list like he thought it might flatter me. I didn't need wine. I needed patience. The menu was irrelevant. I ordered the simplest thing, pasta with olive oil and lemon. He got the filet mignon again, because of course he did. The waiter left. The performance began. "How have you been feeling lately?" he asked, tone dipped in soft concern. "Juliet said you seemed a little scattered last week." I smiled. "Oh, I've always been scattered. That's how I managed to stay unpredictable." He laughed politely. It didn't reach his eyes. We moved through the charade of catching up. He told me about Juliet's new job offer at a tech nonprofit that had suspiciously vague funding. I told him about my begonias and let him pretend he understood gardening. Then, somewhere between the salad and the main course, he leaned forward, hands folded, voice just a shade too gentle. "I hope you don't mind me saying this, Cordelia, but Juliet and I have been talking. Just thinking about the future, you know. Your care, in particular." My fork paused midair. I let it hover. Slowly, deliberately, I placed it back on the plate and dabbed my mouth with the napkin. "My care?" "Well, yes," he continued, emboldened. "Not that anything's wrong. But at your age, it's important to be proactive. There are some excellent places. High-end, discreet, safe. We've been considering options. Options, like I was a liability with a shelf life." I took a long sip of water, clear, neutral, cleansing. Then I tilted my head just slightly. "That's very thoughtful of you," I said sweetly. "Truly." He exhaled, a little too pleased with himself. I set down the glass, folded my hands, and smiled again, this time like a cat considering which part of the mouse to eat first. "You'll make a fine prison husband." The silence that followed was crystalline. "What?" he asked, the word flat and stupid on his tongue. I leaned in. I repeated, voice low, surgical. "You'll make a fine prison husband. You've got the charm, the patience, the complete lack of moral backbone. You'll do beautifully." He blinked, once, twice, then sat back trying to recalibrate. "I don't understand." "No, you don't," I said, interrupting with surgical precision. "You think because I occasionally misplace a spoon or mention a wrong date that I'm unraveling, that I'm ripe for harvesting. But what you don't understand, Cameron, is that confusion is sometimes a tactic." I paused, letting the words land. He stared, eyes darting, the way people do when they're trying to remember what they might have said out loud. "I taught strategy at one of the finest universities in the country," I continued. "I can predict a man's lie from the way he folds his napkin." Cameron's was folded twice and tucked under his plate, classic sign of someone trying to hide disorder. "You're not the first man to underestimate an aging woman," I added, "and you won't be the last, but you'll be among the most publicly corrected." He tried to speak again, but I raised one hand. "This dinner," I said, "is now officially over. You've had your say, and I've had my fill." I stood slowly, the way women like me are taught to leave rooms, with grace and no apologies. He didn't follow. Of course he didn't, because he knew. I walked past the waitstaff, past the photographs of dead men with secrets, and stepped into the night air with my coat unbuttoned and my plan fully intact. The next day, Harper would file the activation clause. Juliet would be disqualified from the trust. And Cameron? He'd be left with an empty plate and a seat at a table where the game was never his to begin with. The next morning, I brewed a cup of black tea, no honey, no nonsense, and called Harper. "I'd like to proceed," I said plainly. She didn't ask which step I meant. That's the beauty of working with a woman who writes her contracts in blood and keeps her calendar memorized down to the comma. Understood, she replied. I'll initiate clause activation within the hour. Clause activation. It sounded so sterile for something so satisfying. Harper explained what would happen next. A certified trigger letter would be sent to the trustees. Documentation of Juliet and Cameron's coercion attempts. Time-stamped, recorded, archived. The clause embedded in Benedict's original trust agreement would take effect immediately. Juliet Price, disqualified from all current and future access. Her name would be removed like a line of bad code. Clean, final, irrevocable. Do you want the trust to revert to you? Harper asked. I stirred my tea slowly, watching the steam spiral like a question mark that already knew its answer. No, I said, not this time. There was a pause. Harper waited, never rushed, never guessed. Redirected, I said, to the Delphia Fund, full balance, same investment structure, quietly. The Delphia Fund wasn't flashy. No gala dinners, no donor plaques, just a few determined lawyers and advocates quietly funding legal protection for elderly women, the kinds of women who'd been talked over, taken for granted, or gently pushed out of their homes for their own good. I remembered the first time I'd read about them. A one-paragraph article in a dusty bar journal, sandwiched between news of a parking permit lawsuit and a court clerk retirement. But the headline stuck. They took her house. She took them to court. Benedict would have raised an eyebrow and said, poetic. I simply called it justice. Done, Harper said, confirming the redirection. Anything else? Yes, I said. Remove the secondary beneficiaries. Juliet and Cameron? Number Juliet, Cameron, and Juliet's next 5 partners, children or cats, just to be thorough. Harper didn't laugh, but her silence smirked. As I ended the call, I set the cup down on the kitchen counter and stood there for a moment, absorbing the silence. This was not revenge. Revenge seeks an audience. I preferred something quieter, closure that doesn't require applause. Later that day, a confirmation packet arrived by courier. Legal transfer completed. Signatures in place. Trustees notified. The money now lived elsewhere, in safer hands for better purposes. $12 million. No longer bait, no longer burden. I tucked the packet into a file drawer labeled simply, Price, Closed. Then I pulled out a note card and wrote Juliet's name at the top. Underneath it, I wrote one sentence. You wanted my wealth, not my wisdom. You get neither. I folded the note and slid it into an envelope. No return address, just clean ivory paper sealed with a blank wax stamp. I didn't mail it. I left it inside the jewelry box, the same box that had once held the necklace, now empty, now just symbolic. Someday she might find it, maybe in a fit of nostalgia, maybe while cleaning out what she assumed would become hers. Maybe she'd open it and read the words and feel nothing. Or maybe, just maybe, she'd feel the ache of what she mistook for cleverness. Because wealth is not just money. It's foresight. It's restraint. It's knowing when to plant silence like a flag. Juliet arrived 20 minutes late, which for her was an act of passive dominance. I let her believe it mattered. She breezed in wearing structured linen and a watch that probably cost more than my car. No eye contact, just a distracted air kiss and a glance around the living room like she expected someone more important to be present. I'd set tea out on the sunroom table. Chamomile, 2 slices of lemon, sugar untouched. Juliet took her seat like a guest at a job interview she planned to cut short. You look well, she said too brightly. I smiled. I'm told survival flatters me. She blinked, then glanced at the tea. No oat milk? I stirred mine calmly. We're back to basics today. There was silence, the kind that vibrates with things left unsaid. I let it stretch just long enough to unsettle. Then I reached beside me to the armrest and lifted a manila folder. I was going through some old things, I said lightly. Found something from your sophomore year at Ashford. She blinked again, this time slower. Okay. I slid out a sheet of college-ruled paper, a little yellowed with time. handwritten in Juliet's old fountain pen scrawl, the kind she only used before she started emailing birthday wishes. The title, Why I Admire My Mother. She froze. I read it aloud. She taught me how to ask questions that don't have answers, how to win an argument without ever raising her voice, how silence can be sharper than shouting. Juliet shifted in her chair. I admire her because she does not need to be liked to be respected, because she remembers everything, even when she pretends not to, because she does not show all her cards, even when she knows the entire deck. By the end of the paragraph, her eyes were glassy, not with sentiment, but panic. I was 16, she said, defensive now. That doesn't mean anything. No, I replied. But it does mean you used to understand me. She stood. What is this? Some kind of guilt trip? Not at all, I said, folding the essay carefully. This is context. She turned, ready to leave. That's when I pressed play. The audio clip was crisp. Cameron's voice, nasal and hurried, spilled into the room. Just get her to sign before she starts forgetting more. We'll have everything locked down by the end of the month. Old women get confused, no judge will question it. Juliet stopped walking. Then her own voice followed, quieter but clear. She won't fight it. She never does. She just disappears into her little routines. She's already halfway gone. The silence that followed was heavier than before. Juliet turned slowly. Where did you get that? I looked up at her with the kind of expression you can't fake after 72 years of reading people like case law. You should have remembered, sweetheart, I said softly. I taught legal strategy and how to record it. Her mouth parted. No words came out. I stood slowly, poured myself more tea. I'm not here to shame you, I said. That would require me to feel surprised. Juliet sat back down, her face a storm of calculations and collapsed defenses. I thought you wanted me to succeed. I did, I replied. But I never said I wanted to fund your failure of character. I slid the essay across the table. Take this, I said. It's the only inheritance from me you won't need a lawyer to contest. She didn't move, so I left it there. Tea cooling, silence thickening. The echo of her own voice, her betrayal, still suspended in the room like incense. This wasn't a fight. This was the verdict. The Bar Association moved faster than I expected. Within 2 weeks, Cameron Voss's license was under emergency suspension for ethical violations pending investigation. Misrepresentation, coercion, conflict of interest. One particularly poetic charge. Attempted undue influence of a mentally competent elder. I read the notice twice just to savor the phrasing. Then I printed it out and filed it neatly in my cabinet under light reading. Juliet lasted a little longer. Her resignation from Women Forward International was described as voluntary, but the PR fallout from her recorded conversation made it very clear. A woman who tries to siphon off her mother's estate isn't exactly a poster child for empowerment. Their mission statement had included the word integrity. That apparently still carried some weight. I didn't call her, not out of anger. That would have granted her more importance than she deserved. No, I didn't call because there was nothing left to say. Some truths don't need to be spoken. They just need to be lived with. I spent the next few weeks doing what every betrayed woman over 72 should be allowed to do without judgment. I downsized. I sold the house. Not out of necessity. I could have kept it, but out of clarity. That house had held 1,000 small moments. 100 lectures written at the dining room table. 1,000 nights of waiting for Juliet to come home without incident. 100 birthday candles blown out with careful optimism. But houses carry echoes, and mine had started to feel loud with ghosts who hadn't died, just changed. I didn't want noise anymore. I wanted elevation. So I moved into a high-rise, 21 floors up, overlooking the university where I once taught jurisprudence and argumentation. Floor-to-ceiling windows, quiet walls, a proper study, and silence, the kind you choose. I bought one new chair, walnut frame, moss green velvet, no matching set, no room for guests. That wasn't bitterness, that was boundaries. On my first morning there, I made myself espresso, the real kind, no pod machines, and sat facing east as the sun cracked open across the rooftop of the law school. From this height, the past looked smaller, not insignificant, just survivable. A young woman in a blazer hurried across campus, clutching a stack of books and her phone at the same time. She reminded me of someone. She probably reminded me of everyone. I smiled. That afternoon I received a letter from Harper. Not an email, not a text. A letter on heavyweight stationery with her initials embossed in navy. Cordelia, you've done something that most clients never manage. You won quietly. You didn't just protect a fortune. You protected your dignity. That is a rarer asset than money these days. She ended with a single line in cursive. Retirement doesn't mean retreat. It sat with me all day like a poem I hadn't written but understood completely. That evening, I hung my diplomas in the study. Not because I needed to remember who I was, but because I never wanted to let anyone else rewrite it. I poured myself a glass of Bordeaux, the one Benedict always claimed was too intellectual for dinner, and raised it to no one in particular. No toasts, no applause, just the sound of someone reclaiming space. The envelope arrived on a Friday morning, thick, eggshell white, with Harper Quill's signature navy embossing and not a single wasted flourish. Inside, a handwritten letter. Cordelia. In my 37 years of trust law, I've watched people build castles out of paranoia and fences out of pride. But you built something rarer, a legacy of intelligence, not inheritance, and you did it without spectacle, only structure. Benedict would be infuriatingly proud. No signature at the bottom. Just Harper's handwriting trailing off like she knew anything more would dilute the point. I placed the letter beside my teacup and glanced across the apartment, sunlight filtering through sheer curtains that softened the skyline. The green velvet chair stood angled just so, watching over the city like it had its own secrets. I hadn't heard from Juliet since the tea. No calls, no letters. Just a silence that wasn't quite absence, more like surrender. And that was fine. Some stories end not with reconciliation, but with restoration. It had been 6 weeks since the trust was triggered. 6 weeks since the law caught up with a man who mistook charm for immunity. 6 weeks since I decided that peace doesn't mean silence. It means knowing you could speak and choosing when. Now it was time to speak again. The guest lecture had been scheduled quietly, without press, without ceremony. Just a plain email from the department chair. The ethics of privacy in the age of artificial power. Would you consider presenting? The hall was full, not because of me, most of them didn't know who I was, but because the topic sounded urgent, and I had a title, Professor Emerita. I walked in wearing navy wool and that same modest string of grandmother's pearls, the ones that had once disguised a micro-encrypted trust in a necklace clasp. Now the clasp held nothing but memory. That was enough. I took the stage not with a script, but with intention. My voice carried not because it was loud, but because it was deliberate. I spoke of boundaries, of power misused quietly, of privacy as a form of resistance, not against visibility, but against presumption. I spoke of gifts disguised as burdens, and burdens disguised as gifts. And then I paused, just long enough to make a room full of law students sit straighter in their seats. We live in a world that equates worth with volume, where inheritance is mistaken for identity, where people measure power by who speaks loudest, not who listens longest. So let me offer you this. Never mistake silence for absence, and never assume the smallest gift carries the smallest value. There was stillness after that, the kind that lands heavy, like truth. I thanked them. I stepped down. As I walked past the back row, a student with curly hair and a notepad looked up and said, "That line, the clasp thing, was that metaphorical?" I smiled, just slightly. Only to the people who didn't open it. Outside, the sky had turned the color of wet slate. My car waited around the corner, but I didn't rush. I walked slowly, each step measured, not like someone hiding from age, but like someone who knew exactly how far she'd come and how long she'd stayed quiet. The city buzzed around me. I tucked the clasp beneath my collarbone where it belonged, still ordinary in appearance, still extraordinary in design.